Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of this new podcast that we call The Blind Spot. And my name is Marcelo Gleiser, and with me you have our co-hosts, Adam Frank and Evan Thompson. Okay, now before we move on and we start what is this podcast really is about, let me just explain that this is part of a initiative that I have called the Island of Knowledge together with my wife, Gary Gleiser, and also William Eggington from Johns Hopkins University. The project is partially funded by the John Templeton Foundation and basically is an idea where we want to bring, and we have been bringing, amazing thinkers from many different kinds of expertise, from academia to indigenous leadership. And in academia, we have scientists, philosophers, writers, artists, to talk about something which is of great importance as far as we know nowadays, right? And so what we're going to do here together is improvise a lot, talk a lot about what we think is important. You know, we have a very rare combination of scientists and philosophers here in this podcast. And as you will find out, the topics are going to be very provocative and we believe very important as well. So the Island of Knowledge idea is part of this project that you can check the website, theislandofknowledge.com, that is here in Tuscany, where I am. Adam is right now in Rochester, New York, and Evan is in, are you in Vancouver, Evan?
I'm in Vancouver.
Okay, so this is wild. We have 9 hours of time zones between the two of us.
Global project.
Crazy. So, but our plan is to produce an episode every 2 weeks or so. The episode is going to be on some big topics on science and philosophy, from consciousness to time to quantum physics to relativity and the interpretation of reality, the future of humanity, AI, etc., etc. So we're going to weave all these topics together as we move forward with the podcast, okay? So I think we could start without much ado right now, talking a little bit about why are we calling this podcast The Blind Spot, which of course is the title of the book that we wrote together, right? So this is not necessarily a podcast about the book, but obviously the ideas in the book are very much in our minds, and it's going to be kind of coming back quite often, you know, as we move on and talk about what we're doing. So let's go randomly and ask each one of us a little bit about why we're doing this, why this is exciting. You know, I met Adam and Evan came to Dartmouth many years ago as part of another project we had called the Institute for Cross-Disciplinary Engagement, which I had this idea, actually talking to Adam even before that.
Because we go way back. Yeah, no, you and I met in, I think it was 2007. I had just written my first book, which was about science and religion, and the writer Casey Cole had introduced us. And so I came out, I think it was 2007, and that's where we had the idea originally of the blog, the group blog, which became the NPR blog, 13.7 Cosmos and Culture, which we ran for National Public Radio for 8 years?
Yeah, at least. That's right. And then we all migrated to other homes, and we're still at Big Think, you know, the two of us. But during those years came this notion of creating this institute to bring scientists and humanists together, right, in conversation. And I think the Island of Knowledge is sort of like the second version of this. It's a more intimate, more long-term. We have these think tanks, which last about a week. Our first one was in October on the nature of intelligence, and Evan and Adam were there. And I literally just finished, early March, we just finished our second one on what is life, a 21st century reassessment. So these are sort of like the topics that are going to percolate our conversation as we go along, right? But I wanted to ask, let's start with Evan. You know, Evan, can you tell us a little bit about the notion of the blind spot and why this is kind of permeating our conversations nowadays?
Yeah. So thank you, Marcelo. You know, the blind spot image came to us actually when you had invited Adam and me to ICE at Dartmouth. I think that would have been 2017 or 2018. I can't quite remember. And I
2017. I think it was
remember,
20. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I remember we were just having a conversation and we were talking about science and its grounding in human experience, in the lived experience of being a human being in a community of others, and interacting in the world and acting in various ways to change it and observing the consequences. And at some point, I think it was I who said this, that the expression "the blind spot" just popped out, and we said, well, the root of science is human experience, but the blind spot of science, particularly our modern scientific worldview, the blind spot of science is the presence of human experience as the ineliminable source of science as a practice, scientific understanding, and the philosophy that became encrusted onto science, you could say, in the modern world. Physicalism and the mind-body split and the objectification of mathematical entities, all of that is kind of an expression of this blind spot.
So, Evan, is it good to maybe tell our listeners what is physicalism? What does that mean?
Yeah, physicalism. So it's really you could say it's a philosopher's term. I don't know how many scientists would actually use it, but it's the idea that everything is physical. Everything, including the mind, including all of human experience, is physical in a sense, which means can be understood using the methods of physics. So it's a reductionist kind of approach. Typically, it says that we have these ways of talking in terms of experience and mind and so on, but ultimately, at the end of the day, what's fundamental is physical. And if the mind is part of the cosmos, then it has to be physical too. So this is something that emerges with the philosophy that gets attached to modern science. It's not a scientific theory; it's a metaphysical theory.
Which is important, I think, for people to understand also that, of the three of us, Evan is the philosopher, right? So Evan's training is as a philosopher, a great philosopher, as I might add. And Marcelo and I are both trained as physicists. So both of us got training as physicists. I spent most of my career being a theoretical astrophysicist, and Marcelo won his fame as a theoretical physicist. So the three of us are coming from, different parts, but it's the whole view of science that and the role of science that we're sort of pushing against the sort of traditional, the kind of stuff you're going to find in all those other podcasts, which tell you that, science explains everything.
Yeah, this is super important, to come up with that notion. It's not so. Right from the beginning, we have to be very clear that this is not an anti-science podcast. Quite the opposite. This is a science. Let's celebrate science for what it is. But what we are going to do is we're going to raise the red flag often, to say, okay, this is going beyond what science should be saying, and that's what Evan meant by, there's a difference between a physical theory and the metaphysics that is behind it, in the sense that what is the anchor in reality of what we're trying to talk about, right? And so, and that could be very dangerous.
It might be worth actually just saying something about the details of the metaphor of the blind spot. So the blind spot, in the sense we're talking about it, comes from the presence of a blind spot in our visual field. All of us have a blind spot, which is where the optic nerve leaves the retina, and there's no light sensitive cells there. And the blind spot makes it possible for us to see in the way that our eye is organized, because it's where the optic nerve sends signals to the brain. But we don't see the blind spot, and we don't, in a way, see that we don't see it. It's just, filled in. And so the idea is that experience is the optic nerve of science, as it were. It's what is the life conduit for the scientific project. And yet, in the way that science works, particularly in its evolution of modern experimental mathematical science, it occludes the blind spot. Or I should say, it occludes its experiential source, and so we don't see the experience that is, as it were, hidden behind science. So we're not anti-science. We're actually saying, if you really want to understand how science works and why it is so valuable, you need to plumb the depths of the experience that lies behind it.
Can I just also want to point that, just so that people understand also what we're pushing against, right? So if you want a really good example of the blind spot, it's the way you get a lot of the hype about AI, right? Which is that, oh my God, we're so close to, creating human minds and, machines, or that AI is close to thinking, being having its own thoughts, its own intentionality, which is like a complete misunderstanding of what we do as living experiential entities, agents, really. So there's just a lot of places in the world where you're going to find, pardon my language, a lot of bullshit about like how, we're nothing but robots. We're kind of like biological robots. We have no free will. Science, people will tell you that science tells us we have no free will. And the view that we're advocating here, which is very pro-science, is pointing out that that line is bullshit. And it's a metaphysics. It's not what science says.
And how does that all connect with this notion that we all have, right, of objectivism, right? Because I think the blind spot and objectivism are very much connected. And so I wonder if any of you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, so objectivism is turning something that is a method, namely trying to arrive at agreed upon observations or agreed upon measurements that are agreed upon, you could say, intersubjectively among a community of investigators, turning that into an ism, which says that there is a way reality is in itself, and our task as scientists is to somehow, as it were, get outside it and look at it from an objective God's eye perspective. And then objectivism is that translation of a method into a metaphysics. We call that, using Husserl, Edmund Husserl, the German philosopher, we call that the surreptitious substitution, the substitution of a method for gaining a certain kind of understanding. Let's call it a rigorous intersubjective understanding, turning that into a metaphysics and saying that what the method allows you to do is how reality really is in itself, independent of you. So that would be objectivism. Another way to think about it actually is to think of, there's the first person perspective, which we all occupy and experience and we share in a first person singular, first person plural. And then there's the third person perspective, where we try to take a more distanced view of things, neutral, you might say. But that third person perspective is still always situated in this first person plural. So objectivism is the idea that there is some pure outside third person perspective. And that's really just a kind of fiction. And that's what objectivism is.
Yeah, if I could add, just to put, make it concretized for those of us who are gamers, anybody out there who's, plays video games. So, you got your first person game where you're running and you can see your hands, or you got, your gun and you're shooting around at the aliens. That's the first person view. And the whole, the way it's set up is to try and make it, as if you're looking out, it's about perspective, right? You're looking out the eyes of the character you're playing, right? So, a good example of that is, right now, John Dunn and I, who's a translator of Tibetan, one of the great translators of Tibetan medieval literature, he and I are playing Ghost Horizon. What?
And a gamer, right?
And a gamer, yeah. So we've been playing Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon. And, you run around and you got your sniper rifle and you're trying to infiltrate the bases of evil guys. And I can see John. I'm looking out at John as his character runs around. Versus, say, something like Spider-Man, which I'm about to play, Spider-Man 2, very excited about it, where, the camera is following over his shoulder. So I'm watching Spider-Man, I'm controlling him, but I'm watching over his shoulder. And it's that disembodied third-person view, which we get from, what we're told in high school is science gives us this disembodied third-person view of, looking at Spider-Man while he does his stuff. And I think the point that we're trying to make, that we really want to emphasize, is that's a fantasy. it's a fiction. It's a useful fiction, very useful for doing certain kinds of science. But in a lot of places, when you try and get fundamental, that falls apart. And if you don't deal with it falling apart, you end up with these ridiculous paradoxes, and you tie yourself up into knots because you don't want to face the fact that this third person view, or the view from nowhere, as philosopher Thomas Nagel said, it's not real.
So just to give an example to everyone, right? If you step out at night and look at the moon, right? And you say, I am objectively looking at the moon because, whatever I do is not going to affect the moon. So I can have a very objective view of the moon, right? So that's the usual narrative. But then you start to think about that. Is it really objective? And then you have to see, well, it is a human being that is looking at the moon. And if you do not have any instrument, you're going to see the moon in the visible window of the electromagnetic spectrum. And so the view that you have of the moon is very much contingent of the kind of animal you are as you are looking at the world. You're not looking at the moon in the ultraviolet. You're not looking at the moon in the infrared. You cannot see details of what's going on the moon, because you are not objectively looking at anything. Everything that we do, every time we look at something, even a faraway object that you would say, oh yeah, that's an objective view of the moon, is really contingent on how we humans look at the object. And then, of course, you can expand our views. I called our instruments reality amplifiers, right? So you have a telescope or you have a microscope, you're going to expand your view of reality, but always from the understanding that what we see of the world is limited always, right? So objectivity, the notion that I can have perfect disembodied information of the world, is really a fantasy. And in our book, we do make this very great, I think it's great anyway, historical comment that the reason why this notion of objectivity permeates so much of the scientific thinking is historical, right? That we mentioned that really when you think about how science emerged, but there was science in Egypt, there was science in many older cultures and civilizations. But if you focus for now on Western science and in ancient Greece, it was really about the stuff that you could look at and perceive patterns of behavior, which is what planets and stars do, right? And they really do seem to be completely independent of the way we look at things until you start to understand that there are many ways in which you can look at the same object, and the information that you gather from these different ways is complementary. So you can look at the moon in different wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum. You're going to see a different kind of information about the moon, for example, the temperature, etc. And if you look in the infrared, and otherwise, that kind of objectivity that we think we have, we really don't. And it's a fabrication, which is very useful, as Adam was saying, for us to be able to quantify nature, right? But there are dangers with the quantification as you start to extrapolate.
I'd like for both of you, because one thing I also think, we didn't go into this in a great deal in the book, but I also feel like the reason we have this sort of blind spot metaphysics, because this last or most recent step in the development of science happened within Europe, was that it was very much because it's kind of a religious view. I mean, there's always this war of science versus religion, but I really feel like this sort of God's eye perspective that people want to glue on to science is really a remnant of the fact that science emerged out of a monotheistic culture, the Judeo-Christian Islamic perspective, that really wanted God to be the frame of reference. And you even see Newton even explicitly using sort of God as the frame of reference for formulating dynamics. So I wonder with you guys what you think about that. That, for me, this echoes so much when I see scientists like proclaiming the beauty of, one law, we want one unified law, that this just echoes a really religious impulse that so many scientists want to say we have nothing to do with religion. And yet then here is this ancient religious or spiritual impulse to have the one, the world tree, the root. So I wonder what you guys think about that.
Yeah, well, who was it? Einstein, who said he wanted to, understand God's thoughts, or the universe as God saw it. Marcelo, you probably know the quotation, right?
Yeah, he basically said, I want to know if God had any option in creating the universe, And then even Stephen Hawking, of all people,
Right.
In his book, he talks about if we get to the theory of everything, right? The TOE, I'm sure we're going to talk about this a lot, but the theory that brings all the laws of physics and the forces of nature into one framework, right? That's the so-called theory of everything. Says if we ever get there, it'll be like reading the mind of God.
Right.
And it's a metaphor, but it's a metaphor that carries a lot of cultural baggage, as Adam is saying, right? And so the notion that there is a blueprint of creation, right? That there is some sort of deep down mathematical message that is always kind of underlying everything, and that mathematics and physics together in particular can actually uncover this blueprint of creation, get to the fundamental nature of reality, right? Has been a driving force for all of these theories that try to formulate nature as really coming from a single kind of entity, which is the single unified field, the force that brings together all forces, right? And yeah, there is a monotheistic underlying current of thinking here, right? That is that not just that there is a oneness to everything, which that Buddhist ways of thinking about that oneness, but it's a very different, and I think we should qualify that as we move on. We're not talking about interbeing a la Thich Nhat Hanh here when we talk about the unified theory of everything, but that this notion that there is this fundamental oneness in nature, and that we, with our human minds, can actually unveil that to everyone. So that's turning science into a prophet, right? There's something, it's almost like the oracle of the world. And even though that's really seductive, and I have to tell you, you guys know this, but definitely that's how I used to think when I was doing my PhD in string theory. There was a reason, it's like, wow, man, can you imagine being part of this exciting kind of quest for knowledge and essentially cracking this fundamental mystery of existence, right? That everything springs from this one thing.
I think, it's an interesting question for us also to ask is how we got here, because in some sense, this view that we're all deeply immersed in science and philosophy, we all love science, but we all sort of ended up with this kind of heretical view. It's heretical now. In 100 years, it may not be heretical. But how we ended up here. What? Because I was a Platonist, man. When I was in high school, I wanted, I was reading books on philosophy. I read about Einstein and Spinoza. I wanted to read the thoughts of God. I wanted to read God's thoughts. And I thought also it would get me girls. And it turns out it doesn't. But at the time, I sort of thought it might. But it was really, I was, deeply the idea of Platonism, that these equations, that mathematics, and as I was first being introduced to mathematics in high school and, my reading, that these were timeless and eternal laws that had nothing to do with the decay and the loss. I had lost my brother when I was 9 years old. He was killed in a car accident, and that had an enormous effect on me. And I was already into astronomy, and I was already looking to the stars as something timeless, changeless, undying. So I had this idea. I loved Platonism, and I would describe myself now as a lapsed Platonist, because I just came to realize that view is actually a human fiction, and there's a more interesting view of the power of science that really folds us back into it. But I started from that Platonist view. I wanted absolute certainty that we're told, as you will be told on many other podcasts, science gives you.
As a philosopher, I want to actually, speak for Plato here, because, so one, there's a real, I think, beauty to that vision. It has a strong aesthetic quality to it that's very compelling. But I think one of the things that's different about the blind spot in the way that we talk about it in the book and Plato or Neoplatonism or medieval philosophy is that in those contexts, there wasn't this, what we call in the book, bifurcation of nature. So the guiding metaphor for understanding the cosmos was really the organism and the intelligibility of mind and life and matter all in a seamless order, which mathematics helped to render formally. And that's very, very different from what happens when you get Galileo, who says, well, I'm going to remove mind from nature and I'm going to look at the world as if it had no sentient beings in it. And what is it? It's matter in motion understood quantitatively according to geometry. So you, of course, with geometry have a Platonic history, but you have a transformation where the idea of the machine and the mechanism replaces the organism as the kind of regulating, governing image. So I don't think it's really Plato so much in mathematics. I think it's the bifurcation of nature, to use Whitehead's term, the separation of subject and object and mind and matter and mind and body, and then the rise of an image of nature as mechanism that can be rendered quantitatively and mathematically. That's what I see as the sort of beating heart of the blind spot, even though many scientists would say, oh, no, we've moved beyond that. We don't think in terms of mechanism in that classical way. I mean, that's true to some extent, but it keeps popping up in life is a machine or mind is a machine.
The AI is a great
exactly,
thing. Yeah,
exactly.
Right.
So I see that as a manifestation of that modern shift, and not so much as coming from Plato, actually.
See, this is why, for our listeners, this is why it's good to have a really good philosopher around. This is why I love talking to Evan. Not only, I'm constantly texting Evan questions, and then often I'll get these responses as if he spent like his entire life waiting for that question. That they come back perfectly formulated. Where if it was me, it'd be full of ums and Evan, these perfectly formulated.
That's just because I'm obsessive. That's all.
But I think that's interesting. This distinction is interesting because there's what physicists get, right? Like, I didn't study philosophy. I read Plato, but I didn't read him deeply. I didn't, go into that depth. And so that what we got as theoretical physicists of Plato through like Russell or, Bertrand Russell, his terrible version of, the history of philosophy was, this sort of vision of like, oh, what mathematics gives you is, the metaphor of the cave, the allegory of the cave. It's a poor physicist's or poor man's version of probably the depth of what was Plato saying. But the way it got filtered to physicists is when we're young and we're in graduate school, we're being told these equations you're learning, these are the mind of God, and it's almost Marcelo, wouldn't you say it's pretty explicit,
Yeah, but it's a little more confusing, right? And I want to see what Evan has to say about that, because when you think about Plato and his notion of the ideal forms, and this that there is this sort of ideal of every object has a certain ideal form. Let's not be very profound about this, but a chair, so there is the ideal form of a chair, which is not a chair as it is in reality, but is the ideal notion of what it is that a chair is or does. And then when it's built by a carpenter or by whoever to become a real chair, it assumes a certain shape. And that shape is never as perfect as the ideal form, which is that chair. And
it's a crappy version of the ideal form, right? That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, so I think Plato always had a suspicion with reality as understood from the senses, and I think that's what the allegory of the cave is about, unless I'm completely misreading it. And that, the notion, for example, I always use this example with my students when I'm talking about Plato. He would say something like, imagine a circle, right? So you imagine this circle, and then in your mind, you can see in your head this circle. And this circle, Plato would probably argue that this is the only perfect version of a circle. is the circle, the idea of the circle that exists in your mind. If you were to represent this circle in reality by drawing it, by using, it doesn't matter how many DPIs your laser printer has, that representation of the circle is never going to be as perfect as the idea of the circle that exists. And so that, I think, became equated with truth, that you can only find absolute truth in the world of ideas.
And mathematics,
And mathematics is a representation of these ideas, geometry, right? He was very influenced by Pythagoras for that reason. And so it becomes, as we move forward, it becomes that, hey, mathematics is the language of this truth of reality. And if you want to get to the truth of things, you have to represent things mathematically. And that is really the fundamental key to the blueprint of existence. And that is I think, the origin of a lot of the blind spot that we talk about, particularly in the physical sciences.
Yeah, we talk about that in the book in terms of the reification of mathematical entities, that, from our perspective, mathematics is a highly refined, distilled form of human experience. And then the way of thinking about it that you were just describing reifies it, turns it into something that would have an outside independent status apart from the human mind. So our approach to it is very much that it's ultimately experientially grounded. And there are views in mathematics like intuitionism, for example, that that take that kind of perspective.
Yeah, one of the big questions I think we'll be addressing, I'm sure we're going to have a whole conversation about this, is this question of, is mathematics discovered or is it invented, right? There's the famous paper by, I forgot the physicist's name, of the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics.
Eugene Wigner, the Nobel Prize.
But I think there's a point here, I think, for the listeners to understand also, that one of the points that we want to make, one of the points we want to explore, because we're not done with this subject, is the idea that there are other ways of knowing the world beyond science. What is called scientism, which is something we're pushing against, is this idea that ultimately any truth that exists has to be a scientific truth. You go to a play, it's a Shakespeare, you love it, you're like, it's amazing, but really it's all just about the neurons in your head, and evolution tuned you to like that play more than other play. And one of the things we're arguing is that, what we have to understand is that science is a very potent, very powerful way of understanding the world, but there are actually other truths as well that aren't reducible to science. And so understanding how to embed science in experience rather than the other way around, trying to say like, oh, experience, consciousness is just, you're just a meat computer. What we're asking is, how do you embed science in experience rather than how do you embed experience in science? So that's a much fuller view of what it means to be human. And that's kind of one of the things we're really interested in.
Yeah. My dad used to like to use the image of an ecology to talk about this. He would say, if you try to create a culture entirely out of science, then it's like having an ecosystem in which you have a poverty of species. You need science, you need art, you need philosophy, you need spirituality, you need all these things. You need biodiversity, and that's better for science. It's better for art. It's better for human experience. It's better for life. So that's, I think, a vision or an image of how to think about that.
And one of the things we're going to explore in more detail is how come this happened? What happened in the history of civilization that one way of thinking about the world, which is this kind of rational, enlightenment-driven way of thinking about the world, took over in a sense and became pretty much the only accepted way of thinking, right? Which led us to where we are now, which has wonderful things about it, all the beautiful technologies that we develop, but also horrendous things about it.
Climate change, right?
Climate change, inequalities, and the kind of economy, the economics that we are living in, right? Where profit is the most fundamental thing, not kind of the equality of everybody in the world. But that's another conversation. But this notion that there is a science-driven campaign to equate success and value with a specific way of thinking about the world, which is what I think Adam is talking about when he's talking about there are different ways of knowing, there are different ways of looking at the world, and arts and philosophy and spirituality, they all have something to say about what it means to be human. And all these different things that each one of these disciplines or ways of knowing have, they give us something. They give us something. And so closing our eyes to everything else and only looking at a specific way of thinking about the world, be it only through, say, religion, so you're a religious fundamentalist, or only through science, you're a science fundamentalist, only impoverishes the human spirit. That there's so much more to being human than just a single version of what's going on.
Right. And when we wrote the book, the first part of the book we says is we're writing this book with a sense of urgency because the world is in a very difficult place right now. This project of civilization that has been built, is really threatened. It's not clear. There's multiple challenges to it that may make it difficult for it to continue. Human beings aren't going to go extinct, but this thing that I'm not going to eat unless food shows up in the at the grocery store, that thing is going to be deeply challenged by things like climate change, et cetera. And we got here, and this is going to be a subject I'm sure we'll talk about. We got here because of this domination of a view of the world, which gets attached to science, right? The idea that a mountain, the only value a mountain has is whatever raw materials it has. Everything else is, it's kind of nice. You're certainly not going to have your political economy be built on it. So in the name of the scientific worldview, we had this whole political economic structure to get built, which is very much the blind spot. And that's one of the things we want to explore as well.
It's interesting, right? Because, and I would love to hear Evan about this, that when we're learning science in school, right, we say, oh no, science is the only true universal language. It doesn't matter what you believe in or what your political party is or where you come from. F equals ma, Newton's second law of motion is the same for everyone. So there is something profoundly democratic and about this way of thinking of what science is like. And I don't think that's true, but I'd love to hear what Evan has to say about this, because that is how people think about science. And I used to say the same thing, in this world of so much conflict and differences, there is something we can agree on, which is the scientific worldview as a universal pathway towards truth. That's how it's sold, right? And there's some of it which is okay, yes. There is some universality, yes. F equals ma for everyone that studies physics, and Darwinian evolution for everyone that's studying biology. But there is a problem with that view too.
Yeah, I think there's something true to the idea that there are methods that are reliable and that can lead to agreement across human communities, different people, different individuals in different contexts. There's clearly something right about that, and science works better than some other, or scientific methods work better than some other methods, depending on what your question is and what the context is. The thing that I think in the way that we're taught science is the lack of any historical sensibility of how science today came to be the way that it is, and how at each step along the way there were always other possibilities, and there were voices. So for example, in The Blind Spot, we criticize this idea of life as a molecular machine. That idea rose really strongly in the 1950s and 1960s, and then, although it's now again a situation where it's being called into question and being discussed critically among biologists, it was very much a kind of reigning way of thinking, and still has powerful voices. But if you read biology in the 1950s and 1960s, there were very prominent biologists who were saying, wait a minute, this is not a good way to look at things. This is not helpful. This is going to skew research. It's going to lead in directions that are not going to be productive. So when we're taught science in school, we're just given a kind of method and the products of the method, but we're not really given an awareness of the deep historical embedding. And there are always different voices, different communities, orthodoxies, heterodoxies. And I think, I was raised in this, kind of counterculture 1970s context. So I'm sort of sensitive or sensitized to this because the scientists I was exposed to at a young age, people like, Gregory Bateson or Francisco Varela or David Bohm, these were always sort of non-mainstream voices. They were outlying voices. They were all really excellent scientists, and they had a different perspective on the plurality of scientific possibilities. And somehow we need to inculcate that into our science curricula. And if we did that, I think we'd have a healthier attitude towards science.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point about the idea that like there are always the thing about the blind spot that we're trying to say is, what we're told in popular media, etc., is that like, oh, this is what science says. Science says you are nothing but your neurons. Like there was just this recent book on determinism. I forgot who wrote it. That basically no free will. You're a machine. It was I don't know if it was a New York Times bestseller, but it got a lot of attention. And we're these people are saying this is what science says. And what we're saying is like, that's not what science says. That's a metaphysics, a philosophy that got glued on, like pin the tail, on the donkey that got glued on. And then we're sold a bill of goods that's what science says. There's many voices that have said in science says that's not what science says at all. But, so I think one of the things we're really going to be arguing and trying to show those other voices, particularly, Evan, the people who were showing up at Lindisfarne, your dad's alternative kind of, in intellectual community, which is also, Marcelo, what you're doing right now, you're the heir to it with the Island of Knowledge, is to show that like a lot of those ideas back then, those people who were kind of, considered, pot smoking hippies, not really, but now their ideas are dominant, right? Varela and autopoiesis, I'm in my physics of life stuff, I'm encountering that all over the place. So,
yeah. And it's funny you too mentioned this because this workshop that we just had this week that we just had about life, one of the things that came up a lot actually was exactly what you mentioned about this need for a rethinking of scientific teaching curricula, right? The idea that we need to first, before you start talking about science, you need to enchant the students, whatever their ages, about the world. So they're like, why are you even doing this? Why we have spent our lives, thinking about nature and trying to understand it? It's because we're in love with it. We believe that we are living an enchanted reality that the human mind can penetrate just a little bit, right? To kind of unveil some things. But when we go and teach science in the classroom, and it doesn't matter where, it's pretty much the same almost everywhere. No, there are some very rare exceptions. That we don't start with enchantment. We start with memorization of formulas and principles and definitions. And that is so horrible, because that is exactly the kind of taxonomic description of nature that started with modern science in the 17th, 18th century, and then went into biology big time, Linnaeus and people like that you have to kind of, everything has to be tabulated and described and classified. And what about the beauty of this stuff and why it is that we're doing it? And that is a complete unnecessary thing, And one of the other things that came up, and this is kind of sad but true, but also funny, which is that no biologists, or very, very, very few biologists, want to talk about what is life or about the origin of life, and which is, I asked a colleague of mine, can you please indicate, kind of like a few people, let me know a few names. And it's like, and this guy has been around for a long time in academia. It's like, nope, very few, certainly not in my university. And I was like, damn, how could that be? So this notion of enchantment and re-enchanting people to look at the world in different ways and then start to understand, okay, what is science telling us about it? As part of the story that we're telling of being humans in the world is essential, right? I mean, we are humans in the world. We started discussing today the notion of experience, right? How experience is the sacred ground from where everything else comes up, right? I mean, you're looking at the moon, great, you're looking. That's the experience of seeing something, and then you can do your theories about the moon or about temperature, and all sorts of other things. It starts with hot and cold, as we described. The sensation of hot and cold comes way before temperature. As
the raw, the direct experience, the weird presence of the world. Like, we're just in the world. We find ourselves in the world and we can't get out of it until we die. And then, who the hell knows? That's what we mean by experience. It's not being an observer. That's way downstream theoretically. It's this raw presence of the world that's where the enchantment is, right? And we sort of tend to bleed all that out by saying, like, you should focus only on the rationality.
Yeah, and forgetting that knowing something in a way where it's a kind of determinate object like the moon through a telescope or with your naked eye, that sort of subject object structure, that actually is sourced in something that doesn't have that differentiation yet. So different philosophers, different traditions have different words for that, presence or intuition or participatory unity, all these different terms to try to remind us that there's different kinds of knowing, as we were talking about last time, and the kind of knowing that is, instrumental knowing is not able to construct itself. It has to be sourced from something that isn't instrumental, that is a kind of, primacy of presence or lived, engagement. And we don't teach science that way. Some exceptional science teachers will convey that, of course, because they have that in their own experience, right? They'll model how the scientific project actually kind of is sourced in that. But there's no, if you open up any science textbook, you won't find anything like that. And even advanced discussions in, say, the philosophy of science don't usually start there. They start with already formed, results or objects and how to interpret them. And so you have to go back to the source behind all that, tap into that.
I think, so for listeners, one of the things that we're going to be exploring on the philosophical side is going to be the philosophies that go along with this. Things like phenomenology of Husserl, Whitehead, the great mathematician Whitehead he was one of our philosophical heroes, as well as as Evan beautifully puts it, the classical philosophies of India and Asia, not Eastern philosophies, but the philosophies that emerged out of these other civilizations. Because what happens with philosophy of science, what you're often only getting is what's called analytical philosophy, which is sort of associated with the English and American schools, which is all about analyzing the truth content of statements, which to me is not nearly as interesting as my presence in the world that I can't get away from. And that's what things like the Nagarjuna, the great Buddhist philosopher, or Husserl were really interested in. So you can look forward to that as we're going forward, some sort of deep dives on that, maybe sometimes with some guests also to exploring that as well.
It's funny, right, that the paradox of science, that it starts with the mystery of existence. I mean, science would not be, right? Science would not be possible if our presence in the world, the fact that we are here and we are looking at things we don't understand and we don't exactly know how we are even doing this, right? So there's this mystery of being in the world that is not just the inspiration for science, but is the inspiration of so much human creativity, right? When you guys were talking about this, I was thinking, you look at the moon, right? And then one person will look at the moon and say, yep, I want to see the details with a telescope, and I'm going to go do that. The other one is going to write a poem about the moon, right? The other one is going to paint something about the moon or compose a song about the moon. But the point is that all of these perspectives are complementary to as Marilyn Robinson once said, to me, he says, is the mystery of who we are as humans, that we try to make sense of things, and we can only make sense of things up to a point, and then we can't. And science is against the kind of perspective of so many people in science. Science is also part of this limited approach to reality that we humans have, and it starts with mystery and it ends with mystery. And
it ends with mystery. That's really the important, and like Wittgenstein, and his whole thing, all the rest is silence, or has to be passed over in silence. It's not that like, oh, we just end up at the end, when we reach these limits and be like, well, we're just dumb, we're stupid monkeys. No, it actually opens up into these other aspects, which is what the art and the poetry and then the spiritual practice also are about. This is why people, there's religion, which is politics, but there's human spiritual endeavor, which we've all written about, which is that attempt to enter that silence, like to consciously enter and explore that science in a place where really words now, it's only going to go so far, but you can still explore it.
So should we next week, this is a totally co-creative thing, guys. This is not scripted, and we're doing this together as we move
Picking it up as we go along.
And as we start to develop a community, we will ask you people, what you would like to hear about too, which I think is very healthy. But I was thinking that maybe for next episode, hopefully in a couple of weeks or so, we could maybe explore the notion of time, because time is so confusing to so many people, right? And it has so many interesting aspects to it. That would be kind of a lot of fun for us to kind of focus maybe on time next time. Is that a good?
Yeah, that sounds
game.
Sure.
All right. So should we say our first introduction to the blind spot is over, and it was so much fun for us, and I hope for everybody else?
Yep.
Sounds good.
As always, the three of us, I just want to note that it's always for me, the three of us, my metaphor for the three of us when we started talking was a band. Like I somehow imagine that when we were like 17, we met and we would sit around and argue about like whether, the Who were better than, the Beatles or whatever, or Bruce Springsteen.
Definitely not.
Yeah, I think the Who were better. I've gotten into this argument.
No way.
All right, how about Lou Reed versus Tom Waits?
Okay, we are dating ourselves here a little bit. Yeah.
But just how much fun, how much I love our conversations. It's like whether it's this form or whether we're just hanging out over dinner. I love talking to you guys. So there you go.
Yeah, it's all about the joy of knowing and learning from one another. And that's what we hope to do here. All right, guys. So see you all very soon.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.